Eleazar and his commanders were determined to force the Egyptians back across the canal. They now planned an exceedingly ambitious and risky operation, and a man who would play a key part in it was General Ariel Sharon. Sharon would later become Israel's prime minister, but in 73 he was one of the country's most dynamic generals and immensely charismatic. He just left the army that summer, but when war broke out, he was recalled. His detailed knowledge of the Sinai, where he'd fought during the Six-Day War, would prove invaluable in framing Israel's audacious new plan. The Egyptians on the east bank of the canal were split into two armies, one in the north and one in the south. 100,000 men and about 1,000 tanks, well dug in and well defended by minefields. They looked impregnable, but one of Sharon's patrols had discovered a narrow gap, just 1 mile wide, between the two armies at this spot, where the Suez Canal joined a large salt lake. Sharon was ordered to push through here with his tanks, widen the gap, and secure a corridor through to the canal. The Israelis would bridge the canal, and hundreds of tanks would then pour across it and fan out north and south to cut off the Egyptians from behind. The Egyptians' positions on the eastern canal bank would then be untenable. For the Israelis, the whole operation would be fraught with danger. The biggest threat was an Egyptian stronghold here, called Chinese Farm. It was just north of the planned Israeli corridor. Sharon had to neutralize the Egyptians at Chinese Farm if the Israeli plan was to succeed.
But what the Israelis didn't know was just how big the Egyptian presence was at Chinese Farm. Large numbers of Egyptian tanks and infantry were gathered there. Unaware of how outnumbered they were, at dusk on October the 15th, the Israeli assault force moved in.
Sharon's tank crews approached Chinese Farm to make their surprise attack. They moved in from 3 different directions, but the Egyptian position was a lot stronger than the Israelis had expected. A ferocious night battle erupted between the Israelis and the Egyptians. Both sides now faced the same problem. The fighting was at such close quarters that it was difficult to tell who was friend and who was foe.
At one point, when my tank had stopped, an Egyptian soldier climbed onto it and asked me in Arabic for a cigarette. He thought we were Egyptians. I bent down and pulled the pin on a grenade and tossed it at him.
All night, the Egyptians put up a stiff defense. They disabled Israeli tanks and killed and wounded enemy soldiers. The Israelis realized they faced a tough fight to secure the vital road to the canal.
The Egyptians were spread out like a horseshoe. They could shoot at us from 3 sides. It was a carpet of fire, the bullets were everywhere. I thought, from here, we are not going to get out alive. This is our death place.
Sharon decided to cross the canal before waiting for the Battle of Chinese Farm to be won. At midnight, he sent 750 paratroopers to sneak across and establish the vital toehold on the west bank. His men had been totally unopposed. But to turn this into a major breakthrough, the Israelis would need to get thousands more men and tanks across the canal.
In fact, the Israelis had built a mobile bridge a year before the war for just this purpose. The bridge was 180 meters long, weighed 400 tons, and took 3 days to put together. Once assembled, it was towed on metal rollers through the desert by 12 tanks along the only road down to the canal.
But there was a problem. Because of the fighting still raging at Chinese Farm, the road to the canal was blocked by a huge traffic jam. By daybreak, the bridge had only traveled 2 miles. There were another 13 to go.
Sharon needed to get tanks across the canal to reinforce his troops who'd crossed earlier. Without the bridge in place, he had to float 50 tanks across on inflatable rafts.
The sudden appearance of Israeli tanks on the west bank of the canal was a huge surprise for the Egyptians.
Soldiers manning the SAM batteries reported that groups of several tanks would show up in the distance, open fire at them, and then disappear.
Later that day, on the evening of October the 16th, the Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir triumphantly told the Israeli parliament their troops had crossed the canal into Africa. In reality, it would be another 2 days before the Israelis secured the corridor to the canal. It wasn't until October the 19th that the bridge was finally in place. As Israeli tanks surged across the bridge, they came under heavy bombardment from Egyptian artillery and aircraft. But the tanks pushed on to their first objectives on the West Bank, Egypt's SAM missile sites. Once these missiles were destroyed, Israeli warplanes swept into the attack, in support of the tanks fanning out north and south on the west bank of the canal. Egypt's Third Army, here on the east bank, was soon in danger of being surrounded. Shazli urged that some units should be pulled back here to the west bank to fight the Israelis. President Sadat replied abruptly, "No retreat." He believed that reducing forces on the east bank would risk losing everything they'd fought for. But Sadat was ready for a ceasefire. It was announced on the 22nd of October. The Israelis agreed to the ceasefire as well, but in reality ignored it and pushed on south to secure more land west of the canal.
By October the 23rd, the Egyptian Third Army was surrounded. The supply lines of its 45,000 men were cut. With only 4 days of food and water left, it wouldn't be long before they were starved into submission.
Some Egyptian soldiers were so desperate they surrendered. Others hung on.
No food come to us, no munitions come to us, no evacuation of any injured, no water, and we didn't need gas because we weren't going anywhere.
And just when it seemed to be over, the war took a dramatic turn. It was at this critical moment that Egypt's most powerful ally, the Soviet Union, made one final bid to help the Egyptians. The Soviet president, Leonid Brezhnev, told the Americans unless they agreed to send a joint US-Soviet peacekeeping force to the Middle East, he would send Soviet troops on their own. The Americans were determined that no Soviet troops would enter the Middle East. In a sudden escalation, America put its nuclear forces on alert. US nuclear missiles were readied in their silos, and 2 aircraft carriers with nuclear strike forces were ordered to the eastern Mediterranean. The implied threat of nuclear war forced Brezhnev to make a choice: to escalate or to climb down. Brezhnev decided to climb down, and no Soviet troops went to the Middle East. But the flurry of international pressure had made its mark. On October the 25th, the Israelis finally heeded the ceasefire, and the October War was effectively over. It's hard to say who was the clear victor in this war. The Israelis, who saw both their fronts shattered by surprise attacks, made an astonishing military comeback. But the Arabs gave Israel a real shock.
For many Israelis, the 9,500 soldiers killed or wounded during the October War was an unacceptably high price to pay. They blamed their government for failing to heed the warnings that war was imminent. Israeli confidence was shattered. They were no longer the invincible military power that they had thought they were.
Despite the fact they'd suffered up to 30,000 casualties, perhaps in the end, the side that gained the most from this war was Egypt. The Egyptian crossing of the canal was seen as a major military achievement that restored Arab pride and gave President Sadat the confidence to make a spectacular bid for peace. In November 1977, the Egyptian president, Anwar Sadat, arrived in Israel, and in the Israeli parliament in Jerusalem itself, he became the first Arab leader to recognize the state of Israel.
ولقد جئت إليكم اليوم على قدمين ثابتتين.
Israel and Egypt were now on the road to peace, which culminated in 1982 with what Sadat had always wanted: a complete Israeli withdrawal from the Sinai. But Sadat never saw it happen. On October the 6th, 1981, the 8th anniversary of the war, Anwar Sadat was assassinated by gunmen opposed to his peace treaty with Israel. The October War had claimed its last victim.
The war didn't sort out the fundamental disputes between the Israelis and the Arabs. In fact, technically, Israel is still in a state of war with Syria. All the treaties and all the talking still haven't brought peace to this part of the Middle East. And this barrier is a powerful reminder that the conflict with the Palestinians over who owns the land remains unresolved to this day.
Next week, 20th century battlefields brings you the Falklands War. In April 1982, Argentina invaded these remote islands and triggered one of the most ambitious military undertakings in British history. I look at how the British fought 8,000 miles from home.
And I'll see how the troops tackled this hostile terrain.
It was in a way one of the century's most bizarre conflicts. It's the story of the battle for the Falklands.